They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be with the next week or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed? And when a British guard shall be stationed in every house? Sir, we are not weak if we make a proper use of those means which the God of nature hath placed at our power. 3 millions of people, 3 millions, armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that which we possess, are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations and who will rise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. The war is inevitable, and so let it come, I repeat, sir. Let it come. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death. Thus, as Patrick Henry delivered this speech on May 23rd, 1775, before the Virginia Convention, regarding the issue of sending Virginian troops to engage in the conflict with Britain, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were all amongst those in attendance. They were there to hear this. Now, they had, in order to avoid any interference from the royal governor at the time, the delegates had gathered at St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond instead of in the Capitol in Washington. And according to Edmund Randolph, after Henry's speech, the entire convention sat in silence for several minutes. Thomas Marshall said the speech was one of the most bold, vehement, and animated pieces of eloquence that had ever been delivered. And the very next month, April 19th, saw exactly what Patrick Henry predicted in the events of Lexington and Concord in the colony of Massachusetts. As General Gage was preparing his troops to march on Concord on the night of April 18th, 1775, John Hancock and Samuel Adams were sitting in the home of Jonas Clark. He was the preacher of the Church of Christ in Lexington. Preacher Clark's wife was actually a cousin to John Hancock, whose grandfather, John Hancock Sr., had been the minister there prior to Preacher Clark. Well, on the historic night of the 18th, a gentleman named Paul Revere rode up to the Clark house to warn them of Gage's men and their orders to seize the weapon stockpile in Concord and to bring back the bodies of Hancock and Adams. Well, they turned to Mr. Clark and asked if the men of Lexington would be willing to come out and stand in front of Gage's men in order to delay their progress to Concord so the munition stockpile could be moved. To which the preacher replied that he had, quote, trained them for this very hour. They would fight and, if need be, die too under the shadow of the house of God. Well, just a matter of yards from his house, the first bloodshed of the American Revolution took place. And on the morning of the 19th, the church bells rang as alarms for the 70 men from that church, led by John Parker, to come out and meet the 700 men of Gage's regiment. 70 versus 700. We know that shots rang out. And after the fighting, Mr. Clark looked upon the wounded and the dead, and that preacher declared, "From this day will be dated the liberty of the world." Hence, the first shot at Lexington became known as, anybody? Shot around the world, as coined by Ralph Waldo Emerson in his 1837 Concord Hymn. Now, he entitled it the Concord Hymn because it was partly in honor of his father and grandfather. His father was just a boy at the time, and he accompanied his father to Concord and witnessed the fighting that took place there. The reason they were both there, Emerson's grandfather, William Emerson Sr., was the minister who had led his parishioners to help a total of 400 men to come out in response to the British troops who had come there to Concord to find the munitions. By the way, they found nothing. And were greatly upset about this because they had been traveling since the night before, all through the night, and had made a 19-mile journey there to Concord, found nothing, and now began to march back to Boston, another 19 miles. But this time along the way, they are greeted by many who have turned out because of the alert system of Paul Revere, William Dawes, Mr. Prescott, and several others. And so, Mr. Emerson's grandfather, the preacher, had brought 400 of his men out there. And as they continued on, they eventually see around 3,000 to 4,000 greeters along the path who met them with their extended arms. I thought that was funny. Apparently, in the 21st century, it's not. So, anyway, they were met by the old country church's members. And so just like Preacher Emerson led his parishioners and Preacher Clark led his, Preacher Phillips Payson brought his men from Dorchester. Preacher Benjamin Balk led his men from Danvers. Preacher Joseph Willard of the First Congregational Church in Beverly brought 2 companies of men. As the British finally returned to Boston and laid siege to the city, many of them missing once they got there, Preacher David Avery brought 20 parishioners from Vermont in support of the Patriots, gathering more along the way. Preacher Stephen Farrar led 97 men from New Hampshire. Preacher Peter Muhlenberg raised 300 parishioners from Virginia to go to Boston. Preacher John Steele raised 900 men from churches in Pennsylvania to march on Boston. Is it any wonder British officials absolutely despised American preachers? In fact, they would refer to them as the Black Regiment or the Black Robe Brigade, due to back then the preachers would wear a black robe when they got up and delivered their lessons, their messages. Well, so great was their animosity, they often would burn or plunder or seize church buildings throughout the colonies. St. Philip's Anglican Church in Brunswick Town, North Carolina, was burnt down in the spring of 1776, as was the new Danbury Church in Danbury, Connecticut, in April of 1777. The Midway Congregational Church in Midway, Georgia, was ordered by Lieutenant Colonel J.M. Prevost to be burnt to the ground after seizing the building in November of 1778. A member of that church, named Lyman Hall, will serve as a delegate from Georgia to the Second Continental Congress, and he is one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Preacher Prince William's Parish Church in Beaufort County, South Carolina, was burnt in May of 1779, as was the Dutch Reformed Church near Bound Brook, New Jersey, later that autumn. The Springfield Presbyterian Church in New Jersey was burnt in June of 1780. The Red House Presbyterian Church in Cassville County, North Carolina, was burnt down in March of 1781. The church's history records that the British were so upset at the area ministers in that locale, as they were leading the people in rebellion, so upset were they that they burnt down the church building and then went on to desecrate the grave of preacher Hugh McAdam, who had just died in January. They pulled his body up from the coffin, mutilated it, and then left it on display for all the other preachers and parishioners to see. In a history book entitled The Light and the Glory, written by Peter Marshall and David Manuel, they write of what the colonists found when they went and retook Boston finally, eventually in March of 1776. And if you come back in the fall for our full-fledged seminar event, you will hear some of the miraculous events that took place in order for that victory in Boston to transpire. Well, when they went in, here's what Marshall and Manuel recorded. The Old South Church had been desecrated. Nor was this an isolated incident. Throughout the northern colonies, dissident churches were systematically abused in a spontaneous manifestation of what seemed like anti-Christian feeling. The Presbyterian Church at Newtown, Long Island, had its steeple sawed off and was used as a prison and guardhouse. Later, it was torn down completely and its boards used for construction of soldier huts. In New Jersey, the church at Princeton was stripped of its pews and galley for fuel. In New York City, the Presbyterian churches were made into prisons or used by British officers for stabling their horses. All told, more than 50 churches throughout the country were totally destroyed, and dozens of others were damaged or otherwise misused. There could be little doubt that the struggle against Britain was fundamentally a spiritual one. This is what we will see in our studies in September as we start with the Pilgrims and then venture all the way to the Civil War. Now, obviously, there will be lots of little details of history skipped in that amount of time, as that is not sufficient to cover a fully history class, but we're going to hit some of the highlights you may not have heard before. And each evening there will be a different display out there, just kind of general displays out there for tonight. But the struggle to establish and build the United States of America, there is no doubt it was a spiritual one. In my graduate studies, I have seen many a different type of historian address the Revolution from all across political spectrums. And one of the unanimous things in all of them, whether they were a consensus historian or a neo-consensus or a revisionist or liberal or Marxist, whatever, all of them agree there was a spiritual battle. I find that interesting. God, as you will see this fall, blessed the effort in numerous and sometimes miraculous ways. Thus, in 1898, there was a church historian named Charles Galloway who said of the preachers of the Revolutionary era, in an address at Emory College, he said this: "Mighty men they were, of iron nerve and strong hand and unblenched cheek and heart of flame. God needed not reeds shaken by the wind, not men clothed in soft raiment, but heroes of hardihood and lofty courage to be the voice of a new kingdom crying in the western wilderness. And such were the sons of the mighty who responded to the divine call. What about today? Could Charles Galloway say the same of Christian men currently occupying America's pulpits and pews? When bakers, florists, photographers, county clerks, what have you, are attacked by the government because of their allegiance to the Bible and what God says regarding marriage, do Christians stand with them and defend against Satan's attacks? Or when sickening political agendas attempt to teach young boys and girls such great immoralities about identity and activity, does the Church of Jesus Christ stand up publicly for the truth? Are answers to the questions of the day to be found in America's pulpits? How relative are the messages we hear? In many, sadly, if not most parts of the country, the exact opposite happens. No one wants to take a stand. No one wants to address the issues of the day, which is in very stark contrast to the men of the Revolutionary era. The preachers of the Revolutionary era. We'll show you some examples of that this fall. Some of the sermons preached during that time as they stood up for what they believed and hence shaped the founding of this country. This is why John Adams wrote in 1765, "Our pulpits have thundered," because truth was proclaimed and liberty was declared. Now, you may have read or heard in some efforts of portraying the history of the Revolutionary era that some have ventured to say, oh, there wasn't much of a spiritual battle. After all, as most of these founders were not devout Christian men or orthodox in their beliefs, they were just simple deists, that's all. The best historical applicable word for that might be poppycock. Although I don't know if we had that in the 18th century. Anyway, so, two examples. Just two quick examples for you this evening, and we'll see much more in the fall. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Two that are usually brought to the forefront. I'll just share with you a couple things about George Washington. One of my favorite books regarding this is a simple, quick little read called George Washington's Sacred Fire. This book, and though I wish it were, it's not large print, is only about his faith. Just his Christian religion. So there's a little bit of information regarding it. Just for a few of the highlights, he read regularly his 1662 Book of Common Prayer. He was recorded as riding up to 20 miles to go to church during the Revolution. We'll talk more about his faith. We'll have a whole night just on Washington. In May of 1779, to Delaware Indian chiefs, he said, "You would do well to wish to learn our arts and ways of life, and above all, most importantly, the religion of," who? Jesus Christ. "These will make you a greater and happier people than you are. Congress will do everything they can to assist you in this wise intention." It's a little different from today. No deist would ever say Jesus Christ, by the way. He wrote to a Christian group in 1788 that there was nothing so earnestly desired as that of converting Indians to Christianity. He was a major sponsor of missions and mission efforts into the western frontier. Approved in 1789 a treaty and building of a church for several Indian tribes there. Referred to Jesus in his writings as, these are throughout his writings, throughout his life, our gracious Redeemer, divine author of our blessed religion, the great Lord and ruler of nations, the judge of the hearts of men, divine author of life and felicity, the Lord and giver of all victory, to pardon our manifold sins, the Lord and giver of victory and the giver of life. He outlawed in his army, he could not stand the immoral behavior in his army, and so he had several regulations to which they had to adhere to be proper men of the army. and outlawed the use of God's or Jesus' name in a profane way, in an inappropriate way. He would receive the harsh punishment. And he staked his reputation in a 1763 letter on my honor and faith of a Christian. That's what he called himself. Not sure why historians today attempt to say otherwise. Thomas Jefferson. Oh, they love Thomas Jefferson. We got a field day with Thomas Jefferson. And for that, we don't carry this book. Not too many want to buy that one. But we do have this one, The Jefferson Lies, regarding the life of Thomas Jefferson on our resource table. Let's just say that when he was President of the United States, third president, he facilitated Sunday church services in the U.S. Capitol, War Department, and the Treasury Department. It was a new city. There were no other buildings there, just the government buildings. So he saw it as his duty to make sure that there were places available for Sunday services. And he attended the Capitol ones faithfully while he was vice president to John Adams and as president of the United States. He signed a treaty in 1803 with the Kaskaskia Indians that included $100 a year for 7 years to pay a preacher and $300 to help build them a church building. So think about that. It takes $300 to build a church building back then, and the preacher would get $100 a year. So if you're wondering how that equals out to, take the cost of a church building today, and a third of that price is how much he was willing to make sure the preachers were paid per year. Must have thought it rather valuable. Signed the 1802, 1803, and 1804 Land Acts renewals for the Society of United Brethren for propagating the gospel among the heathen. He too was a supporter of Christian missions. In 1813, he gave to and became a lifelong member of the Virginia Bible Society, gave to at least 6 church building projects in Virginia. In a time when they were very expensive, books, very, very expensive. Guess who helped start the first Congregational Library, National Library? Thomas Jefferson. He donated. In fact, if you go to the Library of Congress today, they have a whole section, you got to make sure you ask to go see it in the tour, that are just Jefferson's books. It's a really incredible display. He had several Bibles. Cost him a great deal of money to have those. And they were of different languages, including Native American languages, so he could make sure they could read it in their own. 1804, he made a portfolio of the Evangelists and entitled it The Philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth, extracted from the account of his life and doctrines given by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, beginning abridgment of the New Testament for the use of Indians. In 1820, he completed a nearly decade-long project entitled The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. This is one of the things they used to attack Thomas Jefferson. They will say Thomas Jefferson edited his Bible and took out all of the things that show the divinity of Christ. And now, as the great 20th century Paul Harvey would say, for the rest of the story, he did the first one. He had 2 of those. They usually only tell you about the one. The first one, the 1804 Evangelist, was his Reader's Digest version in order to be used for missionaries to Native Americans. An abridged version, so they could just highlight the great things of Christ's life in the Gospels. Instead of getting all 4 Gospels read, here's just an abridged version you could read to share the good news of Jesus Christ. And it did include miracles and his declarations of the divine, that he was God in the flesh. And in the abridged version of 1820, that's the one you'll usually see, what he was doing was writing down the moral teachings, the moral philosophies of Jesus, and then comparing it to other great philosophers of history in order to draw the conclusion that none come even close to the teachings of our Savior Jesus. And it too also contains some miracles and stuff there as well. Jefferson, in both works, included passages that contain the spiritual, miraculous, and supernatural accounts. He wrote to friends Benjamin Rush and William Short that he still firmly believed in the deity of Christ. What transpired with Thomas Jefferson, as you can read in the book or whatever, is that he was often a major contributor to and participant of whatever the prevailing religious thought was of his home area there in Virginia. including a little movement that came through in the early 19th century called the Restoration Movement, and became an ardent supporter and an active member of that movement during that time. But then following that, there were men who came in from the north, and especially of England, who were of the new Unitarian belief. And near the end of his life, his good friend up in the north, where the Unitarian belief was prominent, named John Adams, rekindled their great friendship, and a long list of letters they corroborated back and forth, and they talked about the religious faith. And there, near the end of his life, Thomas Jefferson said he no longer believed in the true divinity of Jesus Christ, that he may have been an inspired prophet, but that he no longer accepted, was more of the Unitarian belief. Those quotes are then taken by historians today to say, oh, see, he never believed in Jesus his whole life. He was always anti-Christian. And that's not the case at all. That's what happened near the end of his life. So, to be honest with what happened in history, there you have more of the full story of Thomas Jefferson. Very devout and orthodox through most of his life, but there at the end, that was what took place. Many of these other types of things we'll deal with in our fall seminar. So, as we start to draw our evening to a close already, I just wanted to tease you tonight so you come back in September. And I'd be happy to answer questions if we have time for that. Let me tell you of Abraham Clark of New Jersey. He was forced by British troops around 1781 or so to reconsider his political position. He was one of the delegates in New Jersey that came in around June of 1776. New Jersey had delegates up to that point in the Second Continental Congress who had stood in opposition to independency. And they had a change of their beliefs regarding all that in New Jersey and elected new delegates. And Abraham Clark, a very highly educated man, very gifted in math and other skills, was approved to be one of the new delegates to the Continental Congress, as he was an ardent supporter of independency, as they would say. So he was selected and went, and just in time, because then on July 2nd of 1776, they voted on Richard Henry Lee's proposal from Virginia that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. The vote was unanimous, 12-0 with one abstention. New York. The New York delegates were not able to receive instructions from their assembly in New York because they were on the run from British invasion at the time. So a few days later, they did receive permission, and eventually they ascribed their vote and signatures as well. They all came and signed it in August, the Declaration of Independence that was later approved on July 4th. Well, Abraham Clark's two oldest sons, he had 10 children. His oldest sons, Aaron and Thomas, became officers in the Great War and the Great Cause, but were captured. And they were sent to the HMS Jersey prison ship. Over 11,000 colonists died in prison ships during the war. From the HMS Jersey alone, 8 bodies a day were being thrown over or buried. That's how fast they were dying in the conditions there. Mr. Clark knows that if he would recant his position, that he could negotiate the release of his sons. We mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. What would you do? He knew that the eyes of all the patriots were looking upon him, as well as the other signers of the Declaration of Independence. And if just one would fall and give way, a domino effect would transpire, which is what the British hoped for, and the colonists would lose their desire to see this cause through. his sons remaining prisoners the whole time. His son, Thomas, he was the second oldest, was confined to a dungeon, supposedly, the accounts record, through which he only received food of what they could squeeze through the keyhole. They survived. Abraham Clark never recanted. And his boys lived to see their country in freedom and liberty. Thomas's life would be cut short. He would die in 1789 because of the physical conditions he came away from the prison ship with. But he knew that if he kept faithful to his oath, that God would be faithful to him and his sons, and he was. So as we remember and we celebrate our freedom and our liberties, it is also proper to remember that since that time, nearly 1.5 million soldiers have given their lives to continue the glorious cause. And around 2.8 million have been wounded in that line of duty. The amazing thing about all that is that it has never been for the purpose of conquest, of empire building, that they gave their lives. Instead, it has always been with the intention of helping an ally, of helping suffering people, of defending America's citizens, defending liberty, bringing liberation to those who are being exterminated, and to fight for a moral or just cause. No other country in the history of the world can say that. Because no other country had our American founding. And so our prayer is that we would continue on in that fight. Every citizen fulfilling their duty, as Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, that they would stand for the rights of their fellow citizens, no matter the sacrifice, so that may God shed his blood, his grace on thee. Who's coming to pray for us?